we are going to go ahead and get started. I've got 6 different things that we're going to go over today. The first one is going to be being able to process up to 100,000 item transactions at a time. So prior to this update, many of you would have been familiar that the most you could have processed in any one transaction was 1,000 items at a time. All right. In fact, many of you may think, hey, I could only do 10 at a time or 100 at a time because you didn't know how to manipulate the menus to show more. But now you can show 1,000 items, or you can transact 100,000 items at a time. So let me show you how to do that. We're going to go in and do a search, and I'm going to go search items. And this is a really basic search. And there's 2 things that are required to transact 100,000 items at a time. Number 1, the transaction must include the item status on it. So I'm going to say I want a list of all items that are checked in, and secondarily, you can only have up to 1 office at a time in the in the search. So I've only got 1 office listed here. If you happen to be somebody with multiple offices, you're going to have to get rid of all of them except the 1 office. And then when I do that, I'm going to go down and just do a search and see how many items come back on this. In my particular site, I have 847 items that show up for this transaction. So the new 100,000 search is when you don't go over here and select anything, you'll see this new menu option up here at the top. This is the transaction for up to 100,000 items at a time. The minute you check any one item, that menu goes away, and now you're dealing with the transaction menu that you're used to. All right. So that's a big thing right there. Keep in mind, you can do the transactions on up to 100,000 as long as you don't select any items in the list. The minute you do that, you're going back to your normal transaction menu. So in this case, I'm not going to select anything. If I were to go up here and say, I want to dispose, it's going to run me through a disposal transaction. And if I were to do it and hit OK, it will take all 847 items and dispose of them. I could run a search of up to 100,000 items and perform that same transaction. So this is something that is really important. I don't know that many of you will be doing transactions on 100,000 items at a time, but it's not unnormal that you may do a couple of thousand items at a time. And the real frustration was in the previous version of the system is you had to go in and select even up to 1,000 items at a time. Now you don't even have to select anything. You just bring up the list, go up, do a transaction, run it, and you're off and running. Okay, so I think the big trick to keep in mind, and I'm going to repeat it one more time, and then that'll be it. Once you select an item in the list, that large transaction option goes away, and now you're dealing with your normal action menu. In fact, you'll notice the averse to that is if I haven't selected anything, these option menus aren't available. So it's one or the other. Okay. So now the question, and so I'm starting to get questions in, and it says, or can you report on 100,000 items at a time? No, this is only for producing transactions of up to 100,000 at a time. In fact, what I would suggest to you is, unless you need to do a transaction of more than 1,000 items, you'll probably never use this option. So you still have the option. You'll notice on my screen here, I'm viewing 1 to 25 of 847 total items. If I wanted to run a report on all 847 items, I would flip it into my large display view. By the way, some of you may not even know this button exists, large view. This allows me to bring up to 1,000 items at a time on my screen. So as the question is being asked, if I want to report on 100,000 items, you can't do that. You can only run reports on up to 1,000 items at a time, because to run reports, you have to select items, and you can only have up to 1,000 in a display. So that's important to note. The mass transaction on 100,000 items is transactions. Check in, check out, dispose, move. Those are transactions. So, but you can report on up to 1,000 items at a time. If you need to run a report on 5,000 items, you're going to have to run through 5 screens and select all 1,000 items to do that. All right. So Other questions coming in. If I wanted to destroy all 2019 items in bin 51H, let me see here, but it says, but I have to keep items in that bin. Can that be done in transaction search results? I would say, especially, you're telling me you want to destroy the items. I believe that that is a transaction at that point. So yes, if you're trying to do a transaction like that, you'll simply go back up to your search parameters. You still have to select checked in, but probably what I would do in your case is I would type in bin 51H and I would say, let me see, for 2019, I would go up and probably put created date is between, and I would put my date range on it. So you're still getting a search. Again, keep in mind, I don't want to overcomplicate this. Most of this is just running your normal search and then doing something that you couldn't do before, which is run transactions on 100,000 items at a time. The next thing is, does this feature work on a large amount of individual items that you scan? So in that case, I don't believe that that would work there. If you go to the scan page, I don't even know what the maximum number of scans are that you could do on this page. I mean, I certainly would think that you could view 1,000 items at a time on here. And so you could run a transaction on 1,000 items, but no, you would not be able to scan 100,000 items and then do a transaction on that. I don't know who would want to scan 100,000 items anyways. So in that case, when you're using a scanner, you can do 1,000 items at a time. All right, so I guess the person that asked about disposing of all the 2019 items from a specific bin, it said, but I can't exclude any items from that bin. You're right, and when you go in and do a search, if we go back to my search screen, in reality, whatever is coming up in the results, you're doing the transaction on everything in that result set. So if I go back here and say, get back to my 800 and something items, I do want to turn large view off. By the way, I tell that to people all the time. Don't leave that large view button on, because the way that thing is designed is it brings up 1,000 items on the screen. I don't want to see all 847 items. I just want to produce a transaction on 847 items. So you're right, Sandy. You can't exclude anything from that list because there's no way to select or deselect. So the only way you could exclude things would be, I would almost say, I would probably go through and tag items, and then I would run a search based on items that are checked in and tagged with a particular tag. That way you could run the mass transaction on those, and you don't have to start excluding things at that point in time. Those are really good questions on that. I never really thought about some of the complexity of that. But yeah, Sandy said, yeah, she's doing that with tags right now. I think for anybody on here that uses tags, and hopefully everybody here is using tags. If you don't know what tags are, you need to learn about tags. You definitely need to show up to one of our training classes. But if you're using tags, running a search that says, give me every item that's checked in with this tag, that's going to be a perfect example of where here's 3,000 items I need to do something with, and you can run them in one single transaction versus 3 separate ones.